Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Dave Kimura.
Hey, everyone.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. And this week, we're going to be talking about infrastructure lock-in and whether or not to make certain decisions, how to avoid it. Dave, you kind of suggested this. Do you want to give us a little bit more context around that? And we can jump in. I've had my own adventures with this lately.
Yeah, and so when I talk about infrastructure in this particular context, I don't mean just AWS, Google Cloud Platform, DigitalOcean, Linode, or anything like that. I mean those, but then also the third-party services that you would use.
Don't you wish that Rails came with a component library that would plug in the widgets, charts, graphs, and other things you need to build a solid user interface? And wouldn't it be even better if it looked great and was easy to integrate? Well, I have great news, folks. I found it. Avo provides all these things along with authentication, advanced search, menu editors, grid views, and a ton more. Plus, there's an open source version that gives a ton of stuff for free. Just go to avo.cool, that's avo.cool, to see what they offer and give it a try. I'm so excited to have an option that works out of the box, doing more than the basic CRUD operations, and I'm thrilled that I don't have to buy an admin theme and then convert their stuff to Rails views. This is built for Rails by a Rails developer, and it's awesome. Go check it out at avo.cool.
So take, for example, I'm trying to come up with a good example, but let's say you're going to write a API, and this API is going to work with Twilio or something like that. If you are putting so much logic in your application around Twilio and sending SMS messages, then you have just vendor locked yourself into that particular client or that third party. And if anything were to ever happen to that particular third party, they go out of business, they change their API, there is some kind of DDoS going on with them, then your application in turn is going to suffer. Users are going to complain that they cannot access the resources that they are paying for and all that kind of stuff. It's a bad situation all around. But if you were to design your API to be a bit more agnostic to the vendor that you're going to be working with, for example, if instead of all throughout your application, you are making direct references or calls to the Twilio platform, instead if you were to extract all of that logic into a plain old Ruby object, and then you have one entry point that communicates with your vendor, then you're able to not only, first of all, have a situation where you then contract with another vendor that is able to do the exact same functionality. You can put in a background job to first try sending out this message with Twilio. If you do not get a successful response after a few seconds or whatever, then you can fall back to this other vendor that you're going to send out your SMS message. So that way you have this kind of redundancy in place without locking yourself into a particular vendor. And if that vendor ever changes its APIs or anything like that, then you're able to go into that one file where you have all of that code set up and then make the necessary changes, update your tests, and then your application is happy again. So that's kind of what I mean around infrastructure lock-in or vendor lock-in. And I'm highly opposed to it because I've been in that situation so many times where something was great when it was first released, but then after a few years, it kind of lost momentum, and ultimately that product or that feature or functionality was sunsetted, and then I was scrambling to find some kind of alternate solution. And more at the infrastructure side of things, when we're talking about the infrastructure lock-in side of things, that's a lot more complicated because you're not just having to make some application code changes. You may have to make changes to your code, but then you're also in the situation where now your code is hosted up at a particular vendor using one of their specific technologies, and you can get yourself in a situation where all of a sudden something just doesn't work, and then what do? Your application's down, or a significant feature of your application's down, and you have no alternative path because you have locked yourself in with that infrastructure or that vendor.
Yeah, I just ran into this actually. So I think we were talking about it before the show, but so I was running topenddevs.com on DigitalOcean's app platform and it worked fine for quite a while. But, and I can only speculate on, what may or may not have caused this because there's no visibility, right, into what they're running. It'll show you runtime logs. So I can see, jobs getting processed. I can see what's coming through on the Rails app, but the rest of the infrastructure is kind of a mystery almost, right? And so I set things up. I was running it, ran into an issue with fireside.fm, which is where we had been hosting the shows before. So I moved everything over to topenddevs.com. I kind of built in the infrastructure. So now everybody's phone or whatever podcast device they're using on their podcast app is periodically pinging topenddevs.com to get the RSS feed for the podcasts, right? And so I rather significantly increased the traffic, right? All the show notes, everything else is over there. I moved the media files over and, they're hosted on a different CDN, right? So that doesn't go through that platform. But when they go to download it, it hits topenddevs.com first so that I can, track a download and deduplicate the numbers and things like that, right? So I have all this stuff going on. And yeah, about a week after that, Top End Devs just quit responding on app platform. And so, I go look at the runtime logs because I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe it's giving a weird response and there's nothing there. I looked in Sentry for errors, nothing there. It's just not serving the Rails app. And so I reached out to support, right? I was like, hey guys, I'm kind of stuck here. And they respond, by the time they got back to me, it was back up. So their response was, well, hey, it works for me. Right. And so I was like, all right, well, maybe it's a fluke, right? Because I had deployed a couple of times since then to see if that would fix it. And I don't know, maybe something I put into the deployment worked or who knows. So I went back to him because it went down again and it'd been down for like 3 hours. So I just determined not to deploy again, right? Mm-hmm. So that it would keep exhibiting the behavior so maybe they could figure it out. In the meantime, started setting up a VPS, which was kind of a pain in the butt. But anyway, so I sent the same message back, and by the time they got around to the ticket again, it was back up inexplicably. So, I moved it over to a VPS. I set up Capistrano because I wasn't deploying with Capistrano. It would just deploy whenever I pushed to Git. I moved a whole bunch of the information that was in environment variables out of environment variables. I'm not a huge fan of putting them into .env files, right? Because I feel like, okay, come hack my machine and just pull them out, right? I can hide a lot of that in the Rails credentials file. And that's generally the way that I like to do that. So I moved all of the stuff out of environment variables and into the credentials and committed that and the whole 9 yards. And so I had to do a fairly significant amount of work, basically reeling all the environment variables back in, right? Because if I can set them in their interface, then the attack area is attacking DigitalOcean's service and not the server. So anyway, so all that said, yeah, I spent several hours the last 2 days pulling that together and then figuring out because I used to just set things up, and just start and stop Puma, but they kind of push you toward using systemd on Ubuntu these days. So I had to figure all that crap out and put it together. The good news is that, yeah, if I ever have to deploy this again, I can deploy it to any Linux machine because I know what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
Right? The flip side, right? Because there's always a trade-off, right? And sometimes the trade-off is pretty negligible and it's like, this is clearly a win. For me, the trade-off is that Rails depends on some system libraries, right? It depends on like the Postgres system library, your Postgres driver compiles against it, stuff like that. So on app platform, it just rebuilds. I think it uses Docker behind the scenes, but it just rebuilds the Docker container and, you get all your updates. And if I'm running it on a VPS or something like that, then I actually have to, I have to periodically be on the machine and run updates, system updates. So that the firewall, if there are any vulnerabilities in the firewall or any vulnerabilities in any of the other systems that it runs, right, that those aren't vectors for attack. I've actually had servers in the past that I just left running. And then eventually it turned out that, yeah, somebody was on there, installed a crypto miner, locked me out of the machine. I guess it's a little bit embarrassing to admit, but it happened, right? Because I had just not gotten on the machine and looked at it, right? So when I needed to update that machine, I wound up having to rebuild it. So anyway, that's all to say that, yeah, the trade-off is that I have the flexibility to go anywhere. I can pick up my infrastructure and I can take it to any vendor, run it on Linux and make it run. I have Dockerized it on my machine and that's how I run it locally. So that's the other thing is I could conceivably push it to Docker Hub and then pull it, deploy it wherever, right? because then all I have to do is make sure that I'm getting an up-to-date version of my image, right? That has all the security updates that I need to run. So there's a trade-off that way too. But either way, yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about as far as like the infrastructure is, that I had no control or visibility into what was going on with my stuff.
Yeah. And, honestly, that just came at a really bad time for DigitalOcean, because I think a lot of people were looking at Heroku and just all the stuff that they've been going through the past year with their stability and uptime. And they're looking for an alternative solution that is production ready.
Right.
That measurements are in place that will sustain an application through heavy load, through issues and everything.
Right. And all I want to do is just push to get and have it appear.
Yeah. Yeah. And the past couple of episodes I've done on Drift and Ruby have been pretty interesting around infrastructure. The first episode was creating a template generator for Rails applications that has a bit different focus. So typically when we talk about the Rails templates, we're talking about adding in functionality into our application that we can then use. But this approach was adding in deployment functionality. So whenever you create a new Rails application with this template, that it's going to give you all the Docker files, the Docker Compose, the production Docker file, and production ready Docker Compose files that you're able to then use and consume. And I paired that with another episode called Easy Infrastructure that sets up a Docker Swarm. That Docker Swarm is running traffic on it and also Portainer. And between those two episodes, you're able to create a brand new Rails application. You're then able to deploy it up to an infrastructure within 2 minutes.
Nice.
And with Portainer, you have the webhooks. So you can just make a post request to a specified webhook, and then that will auto trigger the deployment, pulling down the latest image and deploying it. So from zero to having a fully qualified domain name that's resolvable to your application up to 2 minutes time. And, that's what I was really trying to solve with those episodes, but it's not a production level application because you are Dockerizing Redis, you are Dockerizing Elasticsearch and your database and everything. That's a good production-y kind of thing to do, just in case of one of those containers go down, then your application goes down, instead of having multiple application services running behind a load balancer or something.
Right. Yeah, I kind of like the approach there. I've had a few people basically, because I was tweeting about it too, I had one or two people that got on and said, well, you're not moving off of all the cloud services, are you? Because there are advantages to that. And because you can get hosted options for Elasticsearch and Redis and stuff like that, right, in the cloud. And I'm still on DigitalOcean. I just moved it to a VPS, right? I just moved it off of that platform. And so my database is a DigitalOcean database instance, right? My Redis is a DigitalOcean Redis instance, right? I don't really need or want to maintain servers for those, but, I may run into the same thing. Now, hopefully those are simplified enough to where it's not an issue, and it hasn't been yet, but yeah.
Yeah, and I really wouldn't consider that a vendor lock-in as far as now you're stuck with no options. Yeah, you are locked into PostgreSQL or Redis, and I think those are acceptable terms, so to speak. But if you were using something specific, like it was a PostgreSQL compatible database server, but it added in extra functionality
that I couldn't port off of,
then you're locked into that specific, infrastructure and that vendor. And I would say that even if you had to get the same functionality by manually creating it or by sacrificing some performance, I would rather sacrifice that performance than being locked into the vendor.
Right.
Because vendor lock-in is really a problem because sometimes it's not even the application code or the vendor itself which is causing you a particular problem. Sometimes your company may get acquired by another company, and that new company already has contracts with Azure or
Right.
Google Cloud Platform, and you have to then transition everything. And if you are relying on something that is very vendor specific, then you're not going to be able to lift and shift as easily as if everything was a bit more agnostic. You know, if you're just using the center Postgres, center Elasticsearch, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, folks, I'm here with JD from Raygun. JD, you guys get like 1 billion errors a month. What are some of the more interesting errors that you've seen over the years?
Oh, that's a good question. We certainly deal with a lot of errors. A couple of things come to mind. When we very first launched, and we kind of expected, we'd see some people sign up and try it. We actually got one of the top 10 Facebook games. Remember when they were huge?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so one of the top 10 Facebook games, and it was, between us, one of the most buggy bits of software I've ever seen. And so it managed to completely blow us off the internet in like our first week of launching. So we solved that.
That's why I couldn't win at poker.
Those Farmville animals, no.
Yeah.
And there was another one always sticks in my mind, because obviously we track JavaScript, and just like with mobile error crash reporting, you can't access the end user's browser console to see errors. So you really want to track that and report it.
Right.
And I remember this one customer, and they had this really fancy animation on the cursor on their website. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, their JavaScript to do that, they deployed a bug with it, which meant that on every single mouse move event of every single customer they had would send an error report to Raygun. So, working at Raygun is like dealing with a constant distributed denial of service attack, and doing it with style.
So if you want to know what kinds of interesting things are going on that you're not seeing in your app, you have to check out Raygun. They're doing a free trial right now. You can get it at raygun.com. So, yeah, and I agree with you, right? I mean, there's no reason why I couldn't get a database dump, move it over to another service, or stand up my own server and set up Postgres or whatever. Redis is kind of fleeting anyway, because it's just, hey, here are all the jobs I want you to do, right? And then Sidekick comes along and says, I'm going to do them, right? And so if it goes away, I might miss some jobs, but that's effectively it. So
yeah, and I've also seen some situations where you didn't lock yourself into a vendor, but you've made it so difficult to switch vendors that's also kind of locking you in. So there was an instance that I had to deal with where someone thought it was a brilliant idea to store important information, application data within Elasticsearch. That data was not rebuildable from the RDSs or the databases records. So all this data was now in Elasticsearch. It was needed for the application to function properly with the data it's already accumulated. But we then had to move it from one infrastructure to another due to an acquisition. And getting that data out of Elasticsearch to then populate it into another Elasticsearch instance is a huge pain. That's not something you want to do. So,
right.
Same way with Redis too. Like if you were storing something important in Redis, you were probably doing something wrong. At any given point in time, we should be able to wipe our Elasticsearch data, re-index it, or restart the Redis services, flushing all of its data, and assuming that it was a volatile instance, so you weren't persisting anything to a slow storage, and your application should still run. It might be slow while things are getting recached or re-indexed, but you should not lose functionality.
Yep, absolutely. So, I mean, how do you manage this? Because I'm pretty sure that like Drifting Ruby runs on AWS, and you have to hook into some of their stuff to deploy and things like that. So how is your approach helping you avoid the vendor lock-in?
So one of the things that I did early on that was a mistake was I jumped in and started using Elasticsearch. And I had no reason to use Elasticsearch except that it was a popular full-text search engine.
Right.
And so one day, Elasticsearch had a problem, and I was unable to boot the application because Elasticsearch had crashed. And it was a managed Elasticsearch instance. It's not one that I was managing, and that ended up causing a lot of problems for me. So what I did was, instead of trying to fix the issue, I just removed Elasticsearch from the application, and the application's still running perfectly fine. So that was a premature optimization that I did without having good cause. Even today, many years later, it's still running fine without Elasticsearch. So that's one thing I would avoid doing, is trying to optimize for all of this growth that you think you're going to have many years later when you just aren't going to have it. So another thing is similar to that Twilio example, where if you are going to integrate with a third-party service, that you create it within your application in a way where it can be lifted and shifted very easily, that you have a plain old Ruby object that you can instantiate and call out to whenever you want to communicate with this third-party service. So you're kind of creating your own little API for this API, and it's going to make it so much easier and better to work with down the road, especially if you are in a situation where you have to move over to a different vendor or something like that.
Right.
And I guess also, if you are talking about a more specific thing around vendor infrastructure lock-in, with, let's say, if you were starting to do some neural stuff, and there is a cognitive language processing thing or whatever it is that you're going to use up in AWS, are you going to be able to, one, create a plain old Ruby object wrapper around that? And then two, is there another service out there that you're able to use as a fallback or a contingency if something doesn't work out the way you were expecting? So I'm not saying that in all of this, I'm not saying that we should avoid everything and just do everything manually or anything like that. But I think that we should just have an awareness that we are making this decision. This decision has a risk. Are we willing to accept that risk?
Right.
And if we're just accepting risks for no reason, then we're just introducing future problems.
That makes sense. Yeah, I have to admit I've been tempted by the Elasticsearch, but I don't need robust full text search yet, so I haven't.
And you're already using PostgreSQL.
Yeah, I am.
So use PG search.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the deal, right? Is that, I haven't had any performance issues that push me toward Elasticsearch, where maybe, I have a larger catalog or a search volume that merits it. But anyway, it's definitely interesting too, right? Because you may wind up falling into some of these traps to solve a problem you don't have. So
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, I don't know. I guess this is a problem that people tend to fall into in a lot of cases, right? I mean, I've met a bunch of people that, they use Heroku for the same reasons I was using App Platform. And then, when they have to migrate, they get acquired or, what have you, and they're pushed to a position where it's like, well, we want all of this on the same infrastructure as everything else, or things like that, right? They have to rewrite whole sections of their app to work in a different way because they're no longer going to be working within the ecosystem that Heroku provides. And anyway, it's interesting to see how it all goes. One thing that I am dealing with my particular move, though, was that, and I know I can move this stuff out of there, but basically I just moved everything into the credentials, including the database string. And I have the intention of actually deploying this particular app under a couple of different domains for different areas of interest that I run, right? So for top end devs, I'm also looking at running it for podcastplaybook.com, right? Because I want to offer the same kinds of instruction podcasts, things that I'm planning on offering on top end devs to podcasters. And so, I've had to go in and figure out, okay, now how do I specify, hey, you're using this database and you're using that database without necessarily having a different, I guess, set of credentials for each app that I'm using it for, because I could have 3 or 4, right? If I decide to set it up, but let's pretend that I want 100 of these, right? So I'm running them for other people, things like that. And so just opening up some of those flexibility angles, where before I would just enter a different value as the environment variable on app platform. So moving off of it is still not a trivial thing, even though
So something that you did mention earlier around the environment variables, the .env or Rails credentials, I think you, and correct me if I'm wrong, saying that it was less secure to have a .env file. than to put in the Rails credentials. And I think if we are talking about our version control, then absolutely, because the Rails credentials are encrypted. However, if we're talking about its final resting place in a production environment, I would push back to say that's not true. That if someone gains root access to that server, it's already game over. It doesn't matter how much encryption or anything you have, you're already screwed. So
yeah, my point is it's not in plain text in a file on the file system.
Yeah, but someone can run the BinRails console.
Yeah,
and then
they can query it.
Yeah. So at that point, security is an illusion.
That's true.
If someone got root access, and
I have thought of that. I just
yeah.
The idea for me, it's almost like storing your password in a plain text file. Yeah, if you know Rails and you know how to open up the Rails console, then it'll decrypt it for you. That it has to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but at the same time, using the infrastructure's environment keys, where you can in Heroku you can set a environment variable and then set it. That's also available plain text.
That's true. You can just ask. You can ask for it out of the environment. That's true too.
Yeah, you can do a print env, and then that's going to list out all the environment variables and their values. But to your question around how to manage all these different deployments, essentially, and now you have this Rails credential file that has the values that you need. Well, I would say number one, you do not want to start branching off your code to have one for each deployment. I've seen that done before, and it is.
Oh, you have? That sounds like a pain. Yeah,
it is a nightmare. Like the folks that had to work on that app, it started out as an innocent thing. This one client who we agreed to self-host has this one request, so they branched their code and they started developing that one request. Not a big deal. Fast forward 10 years, now they have 20 other clients and they have 20 other branches. And whenever they make one code change to their trunk or to their master branch, they're having to make sure that all of these other branches are getting that code as well without any merge conflicts. So it's a nightmare. But anyways, what I would suggest is use the Rails credentials for anything internals for your application. So anything that you're going to be connecting to Twilio or anything like that, anything that can be easily shared amongst all of your different deployments. But then you will have the environment variables within that infrastructure that you're hosting at have these specific infrastructure level connection strings to the Redis, to the database, and that kind of stuff. I think the two can work together just fine if you allow them. So I think that's what my approach would be.
Yeah, there's no reason why you can't do both. Yeah, the ones that I'm a little bit leery about sharing are like the Stripe keys and stuff like that.
Yeah. And, in that case, it's better to, I would say it's probably better to use the infrastructure's credential manager or whatever, as long as it is as simple as you put in a key, you put in its value. And when you create a instance, whether it's a container instance or whatever, that it is available within the environment variables.
Right.
As long as that's the truth or the case, then we're good. If you are having to do some other, mixery to get those values. For example, AWS had their key management system 5 years ago where it was available to the instance, but you had to query AWS to get the keys and values. So that it kind of worked, but I had to create this whole wrapper around that to then load it into environment variables. And that wasn't fun. But I would say, it's probably better. You're better off creating a infrastructure level environment variables instead of using the Rails credentials in this particular case, because then you can build one Docker image and then have that one Docker image be your golden image that you're then triggering to deploy to your 100 different top-end dev-esque like services, and they're all going to work because they are all using the exact same Docker image. You can essentially reduce your troubleshooting down to, are all my servers down or is just one? If just one, then I know it's something infrastructure level over there and not something with the Docker container that the Docker image that we built.
Yep, makes sense. Cool. Well, that's kind of the next stage of things, is getting that together. But I just had to get it up and running, so I just kind of quick and dirty moved everything over to the credentials. But I recognize that, yeah, the areas where I'm going to have to be flexible and change things it's probably going to wind up in environment variables one way or the other.
Or, alternatively, you could just make this one crazy big application, a multi-tenant application. And if you want to have other people sign up and stuff, you can have a multi-tenant within a multi-tenant application.
Why does that sound like a giant amount of pain?
Oh, I'm not saying it wouldn't be a pain, but it's basically one of those things where you would use like the Stripe Marketplace, or what do they call it? The Stripe Connect, that allows you to have vendors then put in their own Stripe credentials to get paid and stuff.
Right, and then I collect a percentage off of that if I want.
Yeah, basically like a Shopify or whatever.
Yep. Yeah, I wonder if some folks use it that way because, you've got the Teachables and Kajabis and all them that do kind of basically that deal, and you set up your domain and point it over to their infrastructure, and then it gets handled the right way. But
yeah, and the nice thing about that is, you're putting all your eggs in one infrastructure basket, but when you deploy once, and all of your clients get the updated code.
Right.
So less risk of having that one-off client's infrastructure getting borked, especially if you're handing over access to that infrastructure, like if they can deploy the code themselves or whatever. But, I think that's a different conversation. But just something to think about. Like, I actually thought about doing a multi-tenant application like that for the screencasting, where I can make it a easy way for others to start doing screencasting and stuff. And, I started out getting it up and running, but then I kind of lost interest in it. And I didn't see that for the time and effort and the reward that it would just be there. I think other applications like Podio or other stuff like that already have a niche in that market. And they seem to be doing a pretty good job at it. Yep.
Interesting. Cool. Well, other aspects of this that we didn't go into, because, I've definitely felt this pain keenly and recently, but... and that's the other thing, too, is like, I moved the web component off of it, but I've still got to go and move the rest of the pieces off of it. And that's been kind of a pain in the rear end. So,
I think the only thing I would say about this is one reason why I have so much to talk about in this particular case is because I've experienced all these things. Now, I've been at the same I've had the same job for over 12 years now.
Right.
I think it's 13 years next week. And it's been through 2 different employers. So, the company I worked for got acquired twice. And we've had to go through all of these transitions, infrastructure changes. We've made choices along the road to be locked into certain vendors and then just realize that mistake. And I'm not saying anything bad about any listener who does switch from job to job every year or every 2 years or something, but there is a certain amount of experience that you get with having to live with the mistakes that you've made. And if you switch jobs very often for whatever reason, I'm not saying that they're invalid reasons, but if you switch jobs too often in such a short amount of time, then you will not experience your mistakes and how they've affected your future self and development. And you are missing out on a lot of learning opportunities there. Or you could just listen to older folks and about all the mistakes that they've made in the past. That kind of works too.
Yeah. All right. Good deal. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks, and then we'll wrap up. Hey, folks, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and lately I've been working on actually building out Top End Devs. If you're interested, you can go to topenddevs.com/podcast, and you can actually hear a little bit more about my story about why I'm doing what I'm doing with Top End Devs, why I changed it from devchat.tv to Top End Devs. But what I really want to get into is that I have decided that I'm going to build the platform that I always wished I had with devchat.tv, and I renamed it to Top End Devs because I want to give you the resources that are going to help you to build the career that you want, right? So whether you want to be an influencer in tech, whether you want to go and just max out your salary and then go live a lifestyle with your family, your friends, or just traveling the world or whatever. I want to give you the resources that are going to help you do that. We're going to have career and leadership resources in there, and we're going to be giving you content on a regular basis to help you level up and max out your career. So go check it out at topenddevs.com. If you sign up before my birthday, that's December 14th. If you sign up before my birthday, you can get 50% off the lifetime of your subscription. Once again, that's topenddevs.com. Do you have some picks?
I would say one pick is a funny thing. I went to the beach the other week with my kids and my wife, and we went to Lambert's, which is the home of the thrown rolls, which is a super awesome place. Like, if you need a biscuit, then you just raise your hand. They'll literally throw it across the entire restaurant over to you.
Oh, so wow.
It's a lot of fun. But yeah, we were waiting. The wait time was like an hour, which is crazy. But they had a little gift shop, and they had these ladies there that were doing hair weaves. And so my daughter wanted one, but it was like $2.50 an inch. So my daughter has like 3 feet long hair. That would have been like super expensive. So I promised her that I would figure out how to do it. And so I went to Walmart, got some of the thread stuff, and weaved her hair. And it was really cool. It was a lot of fun doing. So I guess just, hair weaving and just spending time with your family is, my pick. Good deal.
I'm going to throw out a board game pick. I know I've picked this one before, but we've just been playing it a bunch lately. It's Dice Forge. So it's a dice board game. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. Effectively, what it is you have kind of 3 different currency tokens. You got fire tokens, moon tokens, and gold. And you win by getting the most victory points. So you roll your dice every turn. So on everyone else's turn too, you get whatever the dice show. And then on your turn, you can buy cards that give you special abilities. You can buy cards that give you special dice face, or you can just buy dice face. And then you swap the faces off your dice, and then, you're rolling for bigger, better stuff. And that's effectively the game. On Board Game Geek, it's a 1.97, which puts it in the realm of like a Monopoly, right? It's a, casual gamer can pick it up. It has a ton of pieces. And so I was a little surprised that it ranked in weight as low as it did. But anyway, the way I described it, that's effectively the game. So it's been fun. We do have some expansions, and the expansions definitely make it a little bit more involved, but it's a fun game. It's well worth picking up. So if you're interested in board games, go pick up Dice Forge. Another quick shout out. We're putting together Rails Remote Conf. It's going to be in August. So come check us out, topenddevs.com/conferences. I was hoping to get a little bit more stuff done on the conferences instead of fixing infrastructure problems with the website, but you can't always pick your problems. So, that might come a little later than I wanted it to, but I'm looking forward to that. And then my last pick. So I watched Yellowstone, and I think they're coming out with is it the 5th season that's coming out? But I went back because I watched all of it, and I was like, oh, I'm going to go watch 1883. And I mean, I listened to country music in the 90s, and so I was a big fan of Tim McGraw and Faith Hill, and they're kind of the lead folks in this show. And then Isabel May has been in 1 or 2 things that I really liked. So, and she's the oldest daughter in 1883. And so I was super excited to watch the first episode, and it's really good. So I'm going to pick 1883 as well as a pick. And yeah, just go check it out. It's awesome. I've been watching it on Peacock. My wife bought a subscription to them for the Olympics, I think, and then just never turned it off. So I've been enjoying that. I don't know if you have to have a premium account or not to watch all these shows, but I've been getting my $5 a month or whatever it is out of it. So yeah, I'm going to pick those. And I think that's all I've got for now. I'm also going to pick real quick. There was an article that talked about how to set up Puma with System D to run with Capistrano and stuff. And I'll tell you, I spent like 4 hours banging my head against the wall before I finally found this one that actually gave you the config that I used that worked. And initially it didn't work, and it turned out that I had a typo in it. But they kind of warned you, if you run into a problem, you probably have a typo in one of your paths. And yeah, that's what I had. So anyway, but that worked out. Now I'm pretty happy with it running now. The other nice thing I know
you were having an issue with the System D. I would have referenced you to episode 60 that I recorded. It's a free one that I use System D to get Sidekick up and running in the background.
That's what I'm working on now. I'm going to have to go watch that. Because that's exactly because I have to move the worker over and, I've got it deploying the code up, but I want to get systemd up and then I can just, when I deploy, just tell it, okay, now tell systemd to roll Sidekick over.
Yeah.
Because and this is an interesting discussion too, but the Capistrano Sidekick gem, it sends a sig term to the Sidekick and then starts it again. So if it's in the middle of a job, it could conceivably kill it in the middle of the job. And that's not what I want. Systemd is a little more graceful with it. It tells it, hey, finish what you're doing and then start over. And that's what I want, run with the new code. So anyway.
Cool.
So thanks for recording the video that will solve my problem for me.
Hopefully.
Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully this helps some folks kind of get an idea of where they want to end up. I'm definitely going to be exploring more of the Docker and push to a Kubernetes type thing, just because I really like that approach. But I had set up VPSs before. I needed something that would just go up right now and didn't want to have to figure out how to deploy to Kubernetes. So
yeah, I would look into Docker Swarm. And I say that because one thing I really like about it is that you can use almost the exact same Docker Compose file that you're using for development as you do for production. You would need to add a few things like the traffic labels and that kind of stuff, or the networks. But I mean, that's really it. You don't have to learn a whole different mechanism for deploying.
That makes sense. And I wouldn't need it to deploy, or I wouldn't need it to stand up like a Redis server and a Postgres server like I'm doing right now in Docker Compose. Because I would just use the cloud systems that I'm using now. So
yeah, I was using Kubernetes for a long time before I looked at Docker Swarm. And looking at Docker Swarm now, I'm like, I can't believe I was ever using Kubernetes. Like Docker Swarm, it's very easy to manage because it really is just Docker talking to each other,
right? And
just orchestrating the pods or the containers and where they're going. I mean, do you really need more than that in your infrastructure?
Not really.
So a lot less moving parts than Kubernetes.
I'll have to check it out.
Yep.
All right. Well, it was good talking. We'll talk to you later. Until next time, folks. Max out.
All right. Talk to you later.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.